Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, AARP Wisconsin, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel.
Charles, can you move a little forward? Step. Oh, well, that's
too much.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, that was just for fun. How's this? Is this good for everybody? Okay.
Everything's ready?
All right.
Governor's race. Have you ever seen a race this close?
Well, it couldn't be any closer. We have exactly the same number of respondents picking each side, 47% to 47%. That means pretty obviously that who gets their voters to the polls between now and Election Day, at least by our data, is where the advantage lies. You know, this has been close in most of our polls, so I'm not surprised to see a close race. But one that's essentially dead tied is a pretty unusual outcome.
Have you ever seen, in the closing week, what moves people, motivates people? We're seeing a lot of big names coming.
Well, I think both sides seem to be well aware of this being a close race, judging by who they're having in, the kinds of rallies, the kinds of advertising, last-minute appeals. So I think, in effect, this just reinforces for everyone that a tight race means that both campaigns are deeply focused on how do you get those voters that support you to go to the polls. How could that change in the last week? Well, some people could break, though we don't have very many undecided voters. Some people, probably independents, could shift. But I'd be surprised if we see a really big change. I've been surprised before, but this last week may be a game of inches, maybe millimeters, to who gets the advantage.
We've seen the partisan divide. How many truly independent voters are there, and how important are they in the outcome of this governor's race?
Independent voters who do not lean towards either party are only about 6% of likely voters. If this were a blowout race, that might not matter so much, but in a race this close, their votes can be important for tipping the balance. They're also the kinds of voters who are not constantly obsessed with politics and therefore may tune in more late in the game. But then finally, they're also the kind of people that are less likely to vote. So you've got lots of things going on with those pure independents that could push them towards one candidate or the other, or lead them to stay home on Election Day.
Charles, is there a percentage on Baldwin-Walker voters, and are you actually believe there will be tens of thousands Walker-Baldwin voters? Because that's what your poll would suggest.
Well, the poll is, if you look at the people's direct answers to the question, the percentage who say they are voting both for Baldwin and for Walker is a very small percentage. It's well under 5%. And some of those are driven because of their opinions of the candidates rather than being oriented primarily by partisanship. So that's how you get that kind of crossover that seems an odd couple for, partisan reasons. What we know about those folks is they tend to be younger, less concerned about politics, less likely to be partisan. So they're, again, the kinds of voters that are not deeply anchored by a permanent partisan commitment, but rather may be responding to the personalities of the candidates or particular issues of the moment.
Charles, you addressed the discrepancy between your final poll in 2016 and the outcome of the election. What happened in 2016, and how confident are you that we might not see something like that again?
Well, I think I can guarantee you it won't be an exact tie in the governor's race, or if it is, the recount will go on for a long time. I think there's always the possibility that voters change their mind over the last week. In 2016, we saw events, including the Comey letter, that seem to have played a big role in last-minute decision-making. That could happen again this time. So I think the real point about the polling is what did we learn from this poll about who's backing whom, what issues do they think are important, and how's that affecting their votes, rather than narrowly the question of where do we fall. I think that, I think 2016 was actually a good thing because it proves that no poll is always going to be right. And voters ought to make their choices based on who they support rather than what any poll says.
Does the fact that Baldwin is up by double digits help Tony Evers in any way?
In principle, it could. She could help stimulate Democrats and supporters of hers to come to the polls. Is not strong evidence that governor's races and Senate races are dramatically different in their ability to turn out voters. And she has had a outside the margin of error lead through our polling and most other polling. So I think that is a possibility. That said, a very close governor's race seems to be likely to be the immediate stimulus for voters to get to the polls and for parties to rally their supporters to get to the polls over the really close race. So it could go either way. I think that she's certainly an asset to the Democrats right now if our polling is right and if she goes in with a substantial lead.
Did you do a dive on pre-existing is the number one or big issue, but did you do a dive into who they believe will actually protect it?
Right. We did not ask who will protect it, and that, of course, is very much part of the campaign right now. We also didn't look at people who rate health care as the most important problem simply because it's so overwhelmingly very important to people that both people who think it's the central issue and those who don't still rate pre-existing condition coverage as very important. So the best bet is people follow their partisanship in believing which side will protect them.
We've seen a record number of people for a midterm who've already cast their votes. Does that make it less likely that something could cause a significant shift in the final week?
Well, certainly once you've put the ballot in, it's not likely to change, and that's one of the reasons parties like to get those votes in as early as they can. I don't know what the current count of total votes cast early is, but there will still be a very substantial election day vote. So to that extent, the efforts that can be made to turn out your supporters between now and election day still is something that's affecting a big percentage of the state total vote.
Can you address the discrepancy between your poll and a lot of the other outside polls in the governor's race?
Sure. So I would say that, first of all, suppose the race really is a 2-point Evers race. That would account for most of the discrepancy between the polls just on normal sampling error. Our poll has been showing a more Republican electorate than historically has been the case here. And most of the other polling still shows Democrats with a 3 percentage point or 4 percentage point advantage in party. That change in our data comes from what people are telling us, not because we changed anything about the design of the polling. But one of the things this election will do is suggest whether partisanship has shifted. We don't have party registration in the state, so there's not really an objective measure you can go to know whether party registration has shifted or not. So the polling is all we have, but that is a difference between our poll, which has been a little bit better it's been close between the two parties versus other polling that's shown a few point Democratic advantage in most of the samples.
Your numbers show voter enthusiasm with a slight edge to the Democrats. Does that lead you to believe the Democrats might have a slight edge in turn?
Yes, it does. We see that both when you move from registered voters to likely voters, using our usual measure of that, the sample becomes a bit more Democratic. And the reason is because Democrats are saying they're more certain they're going to vote. Not by a lot, but by a little bit. But in most midterms, it's Republicans that have an advantage there. So this is a case where any kind of Democratic advantage right now is in contrast to a lot of midterms in Wisconsin that have tended to favor Republicans. If we look at it by simple enthusiasm as opposed to certainty of vote, the results turn out to be almost identical to what they are with our likely voter model. So I'm not sure that enthusiasm or certainty to vote at this late date is really any different from one another. We're really seeing the same implied vote regardless of which measure you use.
Thanks,
Okay.
Charles. Appreciate it.
All righty.
Nothing on early voting suggests higher turnout.
Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, AARP Wisconsin, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.